Okay, Tom, I think we're ready to start.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Tom Brackett. I'm the president and CEO of the New Jersey State Chamber of Commerce. I want to welcome you to the final in our series of webinars that we are hosting with the support of Bank of America as we share a commitment to advancing the principles of diversity and inclusion. In October, we held a facilitated discussion with Dr. DeForest Buster Soares and others that provided a roadmap for individuals interested in serving on paid corporate boards. In November, we convened a series of conversations with Governor Murphy's Director of Appointments to highlight the process of being appointed to government board or commissions. And today's discussion will revolve around nonprofit boards, a topic which speaks to two of our diversity and inclusion priorities, board diversity and corporate citizenship. Our goal for each of these conversations is very simple, yet incredibly important: to infuse the principles of diversity and inclusion in every part of New Jersey's business community and expand the places in which our colleagues can contribute to New Jersey's economy in innovative ways. Today's conversation is part of that process. Before we get started, I want to remind everybody that we are recording this webinar and a replay of this will be available sometime next week. Also, if you wish to ask a question, please do so via the chat box and we will get to as many questions as possible before the 10 o'clock cutoff date. Today's discussion will be moderated by Patricia Teffenhart, Senior Vice President of the New Jersey State Chamber. And before we turn things over to Patricia, let me first hand the virtual microphone over to one of our board members and a very strong supporter of the Chamber, Alberto Garofalo, who is the President, Bank of America, New Jersey, who will share a few words about Bank of America's commitment to the issues of diversity and inclusion. Alberto, it's all yours.
Hey, thank you, Tom, and good morning. Can you hear me? Can you hear me okay? Sorry. All right, awesome, thank you. Good morning, everybody, and Tom, thank you so much for the warm introduction. It's always an honor to be here with you, and obviously, particularly this one as we close out this sort of series of business case for diversity webinars. And really to everyone, just thank you. It is an honor to be here. When I was approached by the Chamber, about the opportunity to engage and respond to the needs that we have across New Jersey and across all of our businesses, we were very intentional and deliberate in choosing the topic of diversity. And when you think about diversity, and when I think about diversity, it helps foster innovation. It helps foster creativity. It gives businesses a competitive edge, and it allows us to respond to the demographic shifts of both, obviously, our teammates and our clients, and of course, our communities. And it helps us attract and retain superior talent, and it allows us to ultimately improve performance. So said differently, it's not only the right thing to do, it is a competitive advantage. And this is why it's so important. The topic that we have today on serving on nonprofit boards is so critical. We've got an extraordinary panel, some of which I know personally, that I know are going to expand on this important conversation. And again, thank you for joining us this morning to be part of it. At Bank of America, we believe our diversity makes us stronger, and the value that we deliver as a company is only strengthened, right? And not only is it strengthened, but it allows us to bring broad perspectives together to meet the needs of our diverse stakeholders. Our board is 50% diverse. Our CEO, Brian Moynihan, chairs our Global Diversity and Inclusion Council since its inception, by the way. And the reason why I share that is because it's important, one, and two, it shows that the commitment and the example starts there. And look, as we wrap up 2021, there's a lot to reflect. It's a time that I always take a chance to reflect and appreciate all the things I am so grateful for. And for us at Bank of America, it was a year of action. It was a year of action for our clients. It was a year of action for our teammates. And it was a year of action for our community. And it will continue through 2022. I'll give you some examples of what I mean. One, we announced a $1.25 billion 5-year initiative to create opportunity for people and communities of colors. Those areas that we focus are health and healthcare, jobs and reskilling, supporting our small businesses, affordable housing. We also announced a $300 million component of that commitment that will be directed to 4 specific key areas: jobs initiatives, community outreach and initiatives, minority depository institutions, and minority entrepreneurs and businesses, and funds, obviously. Last month, and this is sort of relatively new. Last month, we celebrated nearly 200 Bank of America teammates with a Global Diversity and Inclusion Award. And it's an award that recognizes employees who go above and beyond to lead efforts that reinforce our commitment to diversity and inclusion and contribute to local and global community engagement efforts. So again, it doesn't even just start with Brian, frankly. We recognize and celebrate that we've got teammates from across the company that are focused in making this an important part of what we do. And while I want to thank all of our teammates for what they do, I also just want to thank everyone who has joined us this morning, as well as the entire sessions that we've led throughout the year. Again, that Tom and team have led throughout the year and we partnered with. I've thoroughly enjoyed these webinar series. I think they continue to make an impact and are keeping the conversation front and center. And look, and over this past year, we have all navigated a global health crisis and continue to, as well as racial and equality issues facing many of our local communities, many right here at home in New Jersey. And I am incredibly grateful for all of you that have stepped up in extraordinary ways. Again, not only by attending these webinar series, but really standing together and in support of one another as we address these important issues. So Tom, and to the entire chamber, thanks for the opportunity to partner in these important series. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Alberto, and thank you, Tom, and echoing both of their sentiments, thank you to all of you for joining us this morning. As Tom mentioned, my name is Patricia Teppenhart. I'm the Senior Vice President of Strategic Initiatives here for the New Jersey Chamber of Commerce, and my particular focus is in our work around the area of diversity and inclusion. We had over 140 registrants for today's discussion, which is a real testament to New Jersey's commitment to reimagining business as usual. And together with the African American Chamber of Commerce of New Jersey, we're working to advance 5 strategic priorities: workforce diversity, supplier diversity, access to capital, corporate citizenship, and board diversity, the topic about which we'll be talking today. Today's conversation is intended for a diverse audience with colleagues from both the nonprofit and for-profit communities in attendance. Our goal is to touch upon points that will resonate with you as a person and as a professional interested in leading and/or supporting New Jersey's robust nonprofit sector. At the end of the day, nonprofit boards establish the foundation upon which the rest of the organization's priorities are built. And those priorities are generally those that address the needs of the communities in which we live and work. A nonprofit board sets the policies that weave diversity and inclusion principles into the very fabric of an organization. And a nonprofit board should ensure that the values espoused in the types of public statements that were plentiful in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder turn into tangible action. And with that, let me introduce today's panelists. Linda Zippo is the Executive Director for the Center for Nonprofits, New Jersey State Association of Charitable Nonprofits. Linda's nonprofit experience spans over 25 years, during which she was named one of the 2014 Top 50 Women in Business by NJ Biz, and was a nominee for the National Professional Women in Advocacy 2004 Excellence in Advocacy Award. Let me add Linda to the conversation. Jeff Key is the founder and principal consultant of Nfinity Enterprises. He has 15 years of experience working in multiple sectors, specializing in providing operations and technology support to small and mid-sized nonprofits and businesses. His experience also includes extensive coaching, mentoring, and leadership development training for nonprofit professionals. Let me bring Jeff into the room. Kathy Ahearn-O'Brien is the Executive Director of Hyacinth AIDS Foundation in New Brunswick, New Jersey, and is a seasoned executive with experience in both the not-for-profit and for-profit environments. She's the co-chair of New Jersey's task force to end the HIV pandemic. Before joining Hyacinth, Kathy was the Director of Human Resources for 2 leading retail organizations in the Northeast for over 10 years. Welcome, Kathy. And also with us today is Curt Harris, who is the Managing Director of Restorative Investing for Rising Tide Capital, where he fosters stakeholder engagement from entrepreneurs, community members, local government, investors, and philanthropists to address the challenges faced by marginalized communities. Welcome, Curt. Okay. So I will also, as we move into the conversation, I'll attempt to add a little bit more context to each of our panelists by putting a little bit more expansive bios into their chat box. They are extensive, and probably we could spend the whole time talking about how incredible that each of them are. So I want to make sure that we have some time to get into our conversation. I want to start by sharing with the audience the fact that I've spent more than 2 decades in the nonprofit sector, having started my career working for a small nonprofit prioritizing the needs of HIV-positive women in the state of New Jersey. Then I worked for 7 years for a national nonprofit, expanding the health promotion infrastructure for and with Latinas and their families. I was in executive leadership for a county-based domestic violence organization in central New Jersey. And before joining the team here at the New Jersey Chamber, I spent 7.5 years as the executive director for the New Jersey Coalition Against Sexual Assault. I've also spent considerable time serving on nonprofit boards, including a few years on the board for the Center for Nonprofits with our esteemed panelist, Linda Zippo. And I'm currently on the board for the Women's Political Caucus of New Jersey. So today's conversation is very near and dear to my heart, and I cannot tell you how incredibly thankful I am that there was such a robust interest in being a part of this conversation. So with that, let's jump in and get started. Linda, I'm going to ask you, if you don't mind, starting our conversation off by framing out why we're here. Again, as I mentioned during our intro, we have a diverse audience of folks with us today, some who are from the nonprofit sector, some who are in the for-profit sector and maybe thinking about how they can become more involved in their communities. So let's start with a real, baseline part of the conversation. What is a nonprofit? How do nonprofits differ from for-profit entities? And if you don't mind, talk a little bit about the sector. How many people do we employ? What's the financial value of their services? And what else should we know in order to take a deeper dive into this conversation?
Sure. First of all, thank you, Patricia, and to the Chamber and to Bank of America. And to all of these wonderful panelists. It's an honor to be part of this conversation. Yeah, it helps to have a common frame of reference. Nonprofit is, it's a technical designation. It's a state level designation for an organization that's established to fill a public purpose. When people think about nonprofits, they often think about the federal designation, charity or 501c3. And that's the most common type of nonprofit, but it's not the only one. So there are nonprofit, there are trade associations like the Chamber, there are condo associations, labor organizations, fraternal, and many, many others. But when we think of nonprofits, for the most part, we're thinking about the charitable, religious, educational kind, and that's what we focus on at the Center for Nonprofits. Why do nonprofits matter? A few different reasons. When we think of nonprofits, we tend to think of the important work that nonprofits do, trying to find a cure, prevent HIV, or provide job training, or provide healthcare, or access to food and essentials, artistic and fulfillment, and religious and spiritual fulfillment, so many others. We think about the work, but we also have to think about the economic importance. There are about close to 40,000 501c3 organizations in the state of New Jersey. Pre-pandemic, they employed close to 330,000 people, or close to 10% of the private workforce in New Jersey, which is more than many major industries like finance, utilities, insurance, and others. So when we're thinking about nonprofits, we also have to think about the importance to the economy. When we're thinking about a strong, thriving New Jersey, we need to factor in how important it is to have a strong and thriving nonprofit community. So as we're looking to recovery, nonprofits are vital parts of providing solutions, and we need to be at this table to make sure that we're working together with our partners in for-profits and government to provide those solutions.
Excellent, thank you. Does anybody want to add anything to that framing of our conversation? Okay, so Linda, you teed it up perfectly. We are still steadily working through a pandemic. There was reasonably a lot of concern about how the social profit or for-profit sector would manage through a pandemic. So let's talk a little bit about that. I'm sure that each of you has had different experiences about how your work has needed to shift and pivot, how your resources may have been impacted, how your employment opportunities may have been impacted, and your staff. So I'd like to open this up to all of you. Let's talk a little bit about the ways in which nonprofits have been impacted by the pandemic, the ways social profit organizations stepped up, the way service provision might have shifted, Any noticeable impact or difference in your resource acquisition? How did your donors change, your grantors, special event management? I open up the floor to any of you who'd like to take the stab at this part of the conversation first.
Hey, Patricia, I'd be happy to jump in here. You know, the pandemic continues to be, quite honestly, a bit of a nightmare for us. I think financially we did okay last year because of the federal pandemic relief money and the state pandemic relief money that was available, but everything else was just a challenge. You know, we do HIV testing out in the community. We run syringe exchange programs across the state. You know, and typically when we do that, staff wear minimal PPE. They wear a mask and they wear gloves, but they did not have access to the full PPE. And our staff wanted to get back out quickly. And quite frankly, we had a difficult time getting PPE. And we also felt guilty trying to get PPE when we knew the hospitals were, you know, so desperately trying to get what they needed. But our staff, you know, our testing, our harm reduction staff were back out in April of 2020. So within a month, we were able to be back out. Our testing folks, it took longer. They were back out in July. Our care and treatment folks, the people who really provide the supportive services, housing, counseling, mental health programs, we are still a mix of remote and in person. Our goal was to have everybody back in the offices full time in January. And right now, today, I'm sitting here saying, does that really make sense, right? You know, cases are on the rise again. And so it's really been an issue of learning how to pivot. And, you know, so the other challenge was that we tend to hire people who are from the communities that we serve. And so the technology skills weren't necessarily top notch. Our clients didn't have access to technology. So as we were going through remote work, you know, luckily we had grants that we could purchase a Chromebook and cell phone for staff, but our clients didn't have access. And so we've had to really work with both clients and staff to discuss what it means to, you know, participate in a wellness support group remotely. You know, what does that mean for confidentiality? I had staff, you know, who are living in an apartment with multiple family members who literally would sit in a closet so that they could get the confidentiality that they needed to provide a service to a client. So, you know, it's been a challenge, and yet we know it's not ending, right? We are still in the throes of this, and it's definitely impacted hiring. I mean, you know, hiring for any sector has been difficult this year, and you know, nonprofits, you know, we struggle with salary compression issues. We are very heavily government funded, and you know, we just went through an RFP process with the state when they said, well, tell us what you need, be creative, tell us what you need, and then we got the same funding. Thank you. So, you know, it continues to be a challenge.
I 100% agree. I was working in my previous job when the pandemic hit and through early May of this year, and can really empathize with the struggles with confidentiality for vulnerable clients. Someone wrote in the chat box, which I think is also an important part for us to bring into the conversation, that burnout for nonprofit staff is a real issue. I think our sector struggles with burnout in general, and add to it the layers of concerns that we're bringing not only for ourselves and our own families, but for the clients and the communities we serve. And that's also contributing to a lot of staff attrition. People are really weighing heavily the considerations of, is this really what I want to do with my life? And can I carry all of this weight? Jeff, Curt, is there anything you want to add to this part of the conversation about the pandemic?
I'll just say, you know, echoing what Kathy said, you know, COVID was really upended society and was highly disruptive. And I think, you know, we all had to pivot. Every single organization did. And I would say that rising tide, you know, we had to pivot and we had to go online and go virtual like we're doing now. And in terms of making our donors engaged, we had to do the same thing to make them abreast of what we were doing, what was transpiring in society, what we were trying to cultivate and, you know, advance our mission. We had to basically pivot with them as well to make them bring them into the conversation and make sure that they were aligned with the organization. I'm also on the board of the Jersey City Free Public Library, same thing. We had to basically pivot there, do all online events. And I think probably what we've gleaned is that this will not abate. I think Kathy had mentioned basically people's capacity to learn and adjust and be upskilled. I think what will happen is that we will probably go back to some type of hybrid, I think regime where you have people who are actually both doing things in person and doing virtual events like this. So I don't think this will ever dissipate. I just think that we'll probably have more of a hybrid structure going forward.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'd say from my perspective, Curt hit the point that I think I saw in my experience and some of the work that I do. So I went from March of 2020, really focusing with most of my clients on website updates and maintenance. And by April, May, I was getting calls from same clients, new clients. Hey, we need to pivot everything virtually. Can you help us get onto Zoom? Can you talk to us about either free or low cost technology resources? So I think on top of really the stress of the pandemic, nonprofits had to make a huge pivot. And I think as it became clear this wasn't going to be a 4-month, 5-month thing, and this was going to stretch on, some of the funding, some of the support from foundations and other sources of support has caught up. But even now, I was scheduled to do an event just before we found out about the new variant, and talking to the client, kind of thinking through, by next year, we'll be doing this event in person. And I think now we're back to a place of uncertainty. So I think the other real challenge for nonprofits has been, it's been incredibly hard to do any type of long-term strategic planning. It sometimes feels like you can only scenario plan for kind of the next 1 to 3 months. And then, a story on the news next week could kind of throw those plans into doubt. So I just think that's been kind of another source of stress and a little bit of a challenge for nonprofits. Hopefully that won't continue forever. But I think we're still very much in the middle of the pandemic with regards to that.
Thank you, each of you. Thank you for contributing to this conversation, and thank you for what you've done to pivot to ensure that the services that our communities need are still available and accessible, which has been an incredible challenge. And I think another layer of challenge, which brings us to the conversation, that we're trying to center today, is around what has this meant for each of us as nonprofit sector leaders in our relationship with our boards, right? That we do have very specific governance structures, and you've each hit on the restrictions and the parameters around the funding streams. And particularly if a nonprofit is heavily grant driven. I recall a time when I was going through a funding site visit in my previous job, and we were going through all of the financial statements that we had submitted, and it was a reimbursement grant, which is nightmare for a nonprofit when you're talking about cash flow. And highlighted in really bright yellow highlighter on their paper as they came for their site visit was, you spent $42 on business cards, and business cards wasn't an allowable expense that you had written into your grant budget. And my response was, yes, but you also know that we had a staff position turnover, so of course this person needed business cards. And so those are those little things that are like a gnat sort of like always swirling around as you're trying to actually focus on the good work that the organization needs to do. And from a nonprofit board, if they are not skilled or equipped in understanding how to pivot or to understanding the funding streams, it places the CEO or the chief executive in a very interesting position to try to educate their board about the day-to-day principles of their job, so that again there can be a partnership in leadership, not just sort of this hierarchical, we're the board and you're the nonprofit executive, and putting you in these like gotcha moments. What are you doing? So let's talk about the role of the nonprofit board. I'd like to start with Kathy and Curt kind of framing out the conversations around like, what are you looking for in a nonprofit board member? I mean, you can Google, like, what's the role of a nonprofit board? And you can find a slew of articles on the topic. I think that there are some consistencies, some sort of threads that are woven into a lot of those articles, but we also know that each of us has unique things that we need. And so I'd like to hear, what do you need from a nonprofit board member? What do you need them to bring to the table? And also importantly, what do you not need them to do? Like, while we're being given an opportunity to set some clear boundaries, what do you not want board members to do so that you can sort of have people get out of the way while you do the good work that you're charged to do? And then Linda and Jeff, please do chime in as well. But if Kathy or Curt, one of you wants to take the lead, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
So, Kathy, you want to go? Okay. Okay, so what I was going to say, in terms of the a nonprofit board and what we're looking for as far as a board member, I think you're looking for someone who is really invested in the mission and someone who really, really is passionate about the mission. In effect, board members are ambassadors of your organization. And I think if you don't readily subscribe to the ethos of the organization or what its mission is, you're probably not going to be an engaged board member. So I think passion is really important. I think the other things that are important are, there's an acronym called the 6 C's in the nonprofit world. So you're kind of looking for people who, have clout, people who are connected to the community, people who can leverage their connections for the nonprofit, and people who have concern, what I said earlier about, being engaged. So I think, those are the primary things that you're really looking for. As far as what you're not looking for, I think you're not looking for someone who is going to over-insert themselves into the day-to-day functions of the organization. You alluded to that earlier, Patricia, when you talked about the reimbursement grant. You don't want that board member to really be involved in the minutia and the picayune details of the organization. That falls within the purview of the ED and the management team. So I think maintain that that line where they don't cross over into those boundaries, but really great ambassadors for the organization and those that are willing to really propel the mission of the organization.
I absolutely agree with Curt. You need people who can be ambassadors for the organization. I think for me, it's important to make sure that the people I bring onto the board round out my skill set, right? That they've got expertise that I don't have. And that then I can rely on them and feel comfortable going to them with questions without feeling like, oh, they're going to think I don't know what I'm doing here as the chief executive here. As far as passion for the mission, I've recruited a few board members who actually didn't really have that much experience with HIV, but they were they're committed to serving, right, and to sort of that broader good. And once they came in and realized the work that we do, they're some of our biggest advocates right now. So I think it's about finding that connection to somebody who really cares about people and who's willing to make that leap. I'll also say that I really like having another executive director of a nonprofit on my board, because I think that, when some of the corporate members of the board start pushing about, well, what do you mean you can't get this done? What's happening? And I've got another executive director at the table who said, listen to what she just said about what the state is putting them through. It's been really helpful to have that other sort of voice at the table support what it is that we're going through at a particular time.
Linda, Jeff, anything you want to add?
I just think this reinforces kind of the larger issue that you were alluding to before, which is we need to make sure that the conversation focuses on what nonprofits need to succeed. And a lot of that is financial. And when we continue to perpetuate funding models that aren't sufficient to fund the work, like many government grants and contracts, that's where boards can really step up in a big way, where sometimes the executive might be in a little bit harder kind of position. But nonprofits and for-profits are not different in that respect. You need to be sustainable. The only difference here is that for nonprofits, the resources have to be put back into the mission. And the studies that I've seen suggest that indirect costs, what some people call overhead, are realistically should be something like 25%. And that's not what funders typically fund. And so we need to have shift that conversation back into what is holistically essential to get this work done.
I'd add in just one more quick point. I had a friend who joined a board probably 2 months before the pandemic hit, their first board service. I think they called me after the first meeting post-pandemic and were like, is this how it always is? And I think one of the things that I've seen in really effective board members, I think during the pandemic, is a mindset of servant leadership. So you come in, there's going to be challenges facing the organization. It's important to be able to collaborate with other board members. And I think a really important part of what I've seen, and I think it also ties into the importance of having kind of a diverse group of folks on your board, is the point that Curt raised about leveraging their connections. right? I've seen some nonprofits be incredibly successful because they had a very diverse set of board members, very different set of networks. And so if one board member wasn't able to make a connection that was going to help the organization in one area, there was another person on the board who could make that connection, make that referral for the executive director. And sometimes it wasn't always direct financial contribution, could have been an in-kind donation. But I think that diversity of networks is really, really important when you're thinking about the reach of your board and the range of issues that you're going to face as a nonprofit.
Thank you to all of you. I think you're perfectly pivoting into the next sort of big segment of our conversation, which is about diversifying our boards. And you know, the for-profit sector and the nonprofit sector are both prioritizing and struggling with how to do this meaningfully, how not to just have a checkbox that says, oh, I have 3 people on the board that don't look like me. But how do we actually intentionally bring their perspectives, their expertise, their lived experiences to the table to meaningfully impact the work that we're doing, and perhaps even encourage us to change direction where that might be necessary, because there may have been too many people that look like me informing the work of the organization for a long time. And so there's a couple things that I want to ask in relation to this, and I think it also kind of speaks to something that someone wrote in the chat box. The question was specifically around executive directors serving on the board of other nonprofits, and how sometimes that can be a conflict of interest for a nonprofit executive's fundraising goals for their own organization, which I think we can speak to in the context of this conversation. But also, I think one of the things that we're very interested in bringing into the conversation is how really creating diverse boards often does also require us to reflect on and perhaps change our operating policies and procedures to, in fact, be more inclusive, to be more accessible. And so when we have give-get policies, Kathy, you spoke about having folks on your staff who are from your community. I know a lot of nonprofits really prioritize also having folks from our community serve on our boards as ambassadors. How do we reconcile our fiduciary goals of having all board members contribute financially and to leverage their networks and bring people to our events and help with our galas and all of the things that we do to raise the necessary non-restricted revenue to do our job, while also balancing the fact that those voices and perspectives are incredibly meaningful, even if they don't have access to those resources that help us meet the bottom line. And I want us to also frame that conversation out for any of our colleagues who are on the call who work in corporate philanthropy, to also start thinking about what are the goals and objectives that you have as you consider grant making to nonprofits. If you have a requirement that 100% board giving be something that's hit, think about how that may conflict with your business priorities around diversity, equity, and inclusion. I just dumped a whole lot on you at once, so pick it up wherever it makes the most sense for you, whoever wants to take the lead.
So we, you know, diversity is a key issue for us. And I think that particularly in terms of a give-get policy, you have to be flexible, right? You just have to be. You know, we do have a give-get policy. I think it's pretty modest compared to what some other organizations do. We do an AIDS, we participate in an AIDS walk every year. And that seems to be an easy way for somebody who has maybe less financial means to participate. But the reality is that if somebody has a voice at the table that I need at the table, I don't push them on the give-get. I can't, because, you know, it's inappropriate, particularly if I've recruited them to be on the board, right? I can't ask you to be on the board because you represent a community in an area where I think you could be helpful in other ways. And I think that's the question, right? Is what does that person bring to the table? And they may not be able to bring me a corporate check from their organization. They may not be able to, you know, invite 10 wealthy friends to buy a table at the gala, but they're going to be able to get me into a school system to provide HIV education that I otherwise wouldn't be able to get into. So you have to be flexible in how you manage it. And it's not a one size fits all policy. And thankfully, you know, the board as a whole, we don't really discuss what each board member contributes to the organization. but I think people have a general sense of who does what, certainly the ones who do larger sponsorships. But they're good people and they recognize that there's, what they do and what they bring to the table.
I just saw in the chat one of the points I was going to make too, which is give get doesn't have to be a set dollar amount. It can be something meaningful to you, which can be whatever dollar amount. It could be something very, very, what some people might think would be very small. So there are ways to be flexible on that too. But yeah, I mean, this goes back to what Alberto was saying to frame this early on, when we, as nonprofits, first of all, we have to walk the talk. I mean, we're supposed to be here to be mission driven, societal focused, and we have a lot of work to do in our sector when it comes to diversity and equity. And there is recognition, but there's also some issue with respect to certain tangible progress being made. So it does start with board members looking, taking a broader view of how you recruit, what you're looking for from your board members, exactly what you were just saying, and looking at the organizational policies and what do your bylaws say with respect to board recruitment and policies? What are your government, how are you onboarding people? How are you, if you recruit somebody, how are you making them not only feel welcome, but encouraging and actually heeding viewpoints. I mean, this is a journey, and that's part of the thing. I mean, this is important business initiative, but it's also, as nonprofits, we have an imperative to really walk this talk and recognize that this is not something that's going to be a finite, here we go and our work is done. It's just, this is an ongoing commitment, and we have to be true to that.
And I'll just add, Patricia, you made a really interesting point when you said, when everyone in the room looks like me, and what you can, bring to the table as far as your lived experience. So I think one of the reasons why board diversity is so important is that, you really want to reduce the potential for groupthink and for the echo chamber. And I think, I read articles, and I think in Forbes and the New York Times, that talked about where you have racially diverse teams, they're actually more accurate in predicting stock valuations. And when you look at the global financial crisis, there's research that says if there had been more women on Wall Street, that the GFC would not have happened, allegedly because women are, have less irrational exuberance than men. So I think you need those different perspectives to really, I think, be a counter to maybe what the group mentality might be. And I think also the reason why this is so important with the census results that just came out, New Jersey is the 7th most diverse state in the nation, the 7th, and more diverse than New York. So I think in light of that, we need to be conscientious about who we're recruiting, who we're onboarding, and getting all those different perspectives.
I'd say one of the favorite sets of conversations that I have now, my past nonprofit experience was working with students, middle school, high school students. I still want to think of them as kids, but some of them are now grown and out in the workforce on their own. But I think there's also a generational component. So technically now I think I'm an elder millennial. They keep shifting the years, so I have to keep track of where I'm falling. But I also think there is, and I think part of it comes with everything that's happened since the pandemic. When I talk to college students, young professionals now, they expect and almost demand a very high level of accountability and transparency. So if your nonprofit is putting out, these are our core values, these folks might not have the giving capacity yet and the influence yet, but they are very, very attentive to what organizations are saying and then what they're doing. So your board is going to be the source of how you operate and your policies and your procedures. And I think all organizations are due for some level of change naturally. I think, we all get into our patterns. It's just inertia. We've always done it this way. So you need some of those new voices in the room to maybe raise their hand and go, hey, I have a question about that. Have we thought about X? And to be able to have those conversations. Because one of the conversations I have a lot is on nonprofit succession, whether that's on the board side, whether that's in staff leadership, whether that's in your donors and people who are giving to you. And I do think that's going to be something that really forward-thinking nonprofits have to start paying attention to. And just the way that culture is set, it's very much, from the executive director, but they're doing it in conversation with the board. So I think it's really, really important to make sure that you're getting diverse voices on your board, but really including them in those conversations. And some of them, I think by definition, are going to be not 100% comfortable. There's not going to be agreement. But I think nonprofits really need to be thinking about that to be able to have, I think, an authentic relationship with their donors, to say, hey, these are our policies because these are the conversations that we're having at the board level.
I love all of that. And I think that really does sort of speak to how we began this conversation, that the nonprofit sector, similar to the business sector, was quick to respond to the societal discourse relating to the murder of George Floyd. And there were tons of publicly issued statements. And I think, to your point, Jeff, there is a generation of stakeholders who are now really looking to serve as watchdogs and accountability folks to say, great, you put out this statement. What has changed for your organization over the last 18, 24 months? How does your board look? How does your staff look? How has your mission or vision statement changed? How are you engaging differently with our communities? And I think that is an important part of the conversation as we talk about our boards, right? Priming our boards to do the work, not just offer the lip service to diversity, but to actually think about who needs to step up, who perhaps needs to step back, who has been driving the change or the charge for a long period of time. Is there anything else that you all want to bring into this conversation as it relates to boards holding themselves and the organizations accountable to really weave the principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion, not just into their boardroom, but into the fabric of an organization?
I would just chime in with a stat that is pretty telling. This is from the Few Trust a couple of years ago, but it speaks to what Curt and Jeff were just talking about, which was, this is in 2019, the most common age among the population that identified as white in the US was 58. And the most common age of people in the United States that did not identify as white was 27. And this, it kind of speaks to how generational differences and changing nature of population, and exactly what we were just talking about in terms of expectations and changing values, and the need to walk the talk and to be forward thinking about how you are looking at your board composition and what you're asking your boards to do and what you're expecting of your boards, and what the boards are. Boards set the tone for the organization. So, if we're going to live our values and lead with our values and execute in the best possible way, that has to start with the board.
Thank you all so much for what you've brought into the conversation. I'm not sure how easily each of you are able to track what's going on in the chat, but there are a lot of colleagues who are listening to what you're contributing to the conversation, and thanking you for not dodging the hard topics and for talking about things that are important for the sector. I think one of the things that I'd like for us to be able to include in this conversation is, it's no surprise, it's the end of the year. Nonprofits are really actively engaged in end of year giving strategies. Again, that might look a little different because we're in the middle of a pandemic, but we're also really inundated, I think, as a society right now, and lots of misconceptions around nonprofits. And so I know the point of our conversation today is to talk about boards, and the goal is to increase diversity on nonprofit boards. It's why we've been engaging in this work with the African American Chamber of Commerce. This is sort of a phase 3 conversation. We started a conversation in October with Dr. Buster Soaries and John Harmon from the African American Chamber, talking about corporate board diversity. And we talked a little bit about, getting on a paid corporate board is very challenging. And that there is a good opportunity to kind of understand board governance processes by getting onto a nonprofit board and kind of becoming familiar with the mechanisms of a boardroom, because they are relatively similar. However, though, thinking about how Linda really talked about the power and the impact of our sector, I would hate for anyone to think that serving on a nonprofit board is a step down from serving on a corporate board, right? That the work that we do in our communities is meaningful, literally saving lives. The folks that Kathy talked about sitting in their closets so they can maintain the confidentiality of their clients while doing remote counseling sessions during the middle of a pandemic. Like, that is work that needs to be compensated, needs to be applauded. And we need our boards to think creatively about how do we shift the power structure so that those folks who are doing that work on the front lines are held up as heroes and real contributors to our society. So as we think about end of the year giving, and I'm sure everyone who's on social media has seen all of those memes, like, you know, you got to look at someone's, you know, tax reports to see whether or not they have a ridiculous amount of overhead, right? And I know those of us who have been and spent a lot of time in the sector, we talk about the overhead myth. So can we, while we're here, in the spirit of the holiday season, who wants to take the lead on debunking the overhead myths so that as our colleagues on this call think about their philanthropic end of year giving, we can assure them that that is nothing more than fallacy?
Oh my, they just need to walk into my office and see the boxes that are like lined in the hallways because we have no space to store anything. My argument on the overhead myth is that we compete in a for-profit world, right? I've got 7 sites around the state. My rent is exactly what a corporate partner would pay. I'm not getting a discount on rent because I'm a nonprofit. There's very few landlords who are like, thank you for doing what you do. I'm going to charge you less, right? My health insurance goes up about 24, 32% every single year, particularly because we employ people with lived HIV experience. HIV medications are ridiculously expensive. And so my experience rating goes up every single year. We just went through our insurance renewal. The Philadelphia Insurance Company is not saying to me, here you go, we'll give you a discount. So the argument that we should operate at a reduced overhead amount when I'm competing in a for-profit world for staffing, for benefits, for real estate, it's not okay. And I think, that's we've got to make that conversation that if you want us to be a professional organization, then we need to be treated like the professional organizations that we are.
Anyone else?
Well, again, it's you asked me to start at talking about this at your peril, because then I'd never stop. But just kind of what Kathy said. I mean, the basic point here is we expect nonprofits to operate and we have driven this expectation that nonprofits are supposed to operate in a scarcity mentality, in a scarcity world where deprivation is the norm, insufficient resources are the norm, and that's just not sustainable. For a while, there may be ways to adjust. Nonprofits are masters of doing that. That doesn't mean it's the way we should be doing. Think about, and again, to the donors or would-be donors, look at the impact. Don't look at the ratios. What is the organization doing? Look at its website. Talk about its programs. It's not going to matter if 25% of the budget spent on fundraising or 10% if the organization's impact is not there, and it is. I mean, and that's the point here. So again, don't want to keep going, but we need to move beyond those ratios, and we need to de-emphasize them. For anybody who puts on their website, oh, I've received this award or recognition because my overhead ratio is so low, you're perpetuating the problem. Please don't do that.
I love it. Okay, so I'm going, and thank you. I love it, and thank you. I felt like I would be remiss and not doing justice to all the years that I had spent in this sector by not giving us an opportunity to include that in the conversation. I'm the keyboard warrior when it shows up on my friends' social media, statuses. I'm like, da, 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 da. So now I have a platform by which I don't have to be the one saying it. You all said it, so thanks. we're coming close to the end of our time, and I want us to leave our colleagues with some thoughts about how to, and folks are asking for this in the chat as well, and we were getting to it, but like, how do we go about diversifying our boards, right? Where have we been successful? Where do we still have challenges? And what are your thoughts, both for the folks who are on our call today who are working in the nonprofit space and who are serious about diversifying and creating more equitable board positions, and also if you are on this call and you're thinking about becoming more engaged in the nonprofit sector, how do you go about that? So the floor is open. So this is really symbolic, right? Like, there's no, what's very interesting is that I don't think that the silence is that dissimilar to the silence that we experienced when we had the same conversation about diversifying corporate boards. Jeff, you unmuted though. I feel like you're going to contribute some words of wisdom.
So it's not, a magic solution, but I think an important point, and I think all of us have done this because of the pandemic. We've had much more time to reflect. And I think as I was thinking about the event today, one really important thing is if you're going out and looking to connect with and recruit diverse board members, you need to be able to speak to them about exactly what you're looking for. So if I'm an arts-based organization and, I want to have expanded access to my programming for, communities that we might be missing in the area that we serve, I might be looking for a very different board member, both in terms of, their passion for the mission, but also the networks that they have. So I look at it a little bit the same way that you might do a job posting, right? Your job posting is going to be more successful. You're going to get better quality candidates that are a better fit if you have a good idea of what you're looking for. So I think a good first step is, do an assessment of your board, who's already there, where are your gaps? And then really when you approach candidates, be able to tie in, okay, you're a diverse candidate, but here's why we came to you specifically. We may know this about your background, right? You have some connection to the arts world or whatever our mission is. You have the right skill set. Maybe this is how we envision you kind of using the networks you may have access to benefit our work moving forward. As someone who is now serving on some boards, that's a much more appealing pitch, I think, to any candidate versus, coming to someone and saying, well, we're trying to diversify our board. And then it's like, well, okay, I check a box, but so do, thousands of other people out there. I think all of us, whether it's for a board position or a job position, I mean, you'd like to think that someone has been thoughtful on why they're reaching out to you and approaching you. So I think being able to narrow that down and have kind of a more specific pitch about why you're approaching certain people helps you. And then I think makes them much more clear about, okay, you're not approaching me because I check this box or check that box. Hopefully it's a combination of things and I'm the right person to fill that spot at this time for what you're looking to do with your organization.
And I think there are ways also to reach out to, need to reach out to other networks. If you keep reaching out to the networks that you're going to have the same result, and you're not going to grow as an organization, as in a board. So, places like excuse me, the Young Nonprofit Professionals Network, or the Nonprofit Professionals of Color Collective, or the Association of Black Accountants, and the African American Chamber, and on and on. There are a lot of networks that you can connect with first, and do the work, and be educated in terms of a lifelong commitment to learning and to moving forward. To Jeff's point, you're not looking to do this to check a box. You're looking to do this because there are every reason, from a moral imperative to a business imperative, to do this. I know our time is short. I just want to sneak in one little thing. When you're talking about diversifying boards, we were talking a lot here about nonprofit boards, but and I know you had the conversation about corporate boards. This is not necessarily a one-way trajectory. So for the corporate board folks on this meeting, think about recruiting folks from the nonprofit community. Nonprofits are resourceful, they are smart, they know how to be creative and pivot and get things done, and we've pretty much demonstrated that. And if you're looking to diversify your board, you'd be well served to look to the nonprofit community to fill your board seats too.
Thank you for that. I agree with everything that you said. I think one of the things that's really important, and you've all hit upon this theme consistently throughout our conversation, but authenticity matters. And so to Jeff's point, when we are thinking about what our boards can and should look like, people know right off the bat, they can smell if you're reaching out to them because you have a diversity box they're looking to check. And so, as is with most things, relationships are so important. And so I think what we've been able to accomplish here today, I hope, is part of a conversation, and Linda, you've really hit the nail on the head. We are not so dissimilar, the for-profit and the nonprofit community. And so when we talk about expanding our sphere of influence or expanding our network, perhaps we should be thinking more intentionally about places for us to commingle, right? So if you are part of a corporate entity, consider joining the Center for Nonprofits and go to some of their events and think about how accessing that entire community of professionals can help change the way you do work, and then vice versa. If you're part of the nonprofit community, consider joining either the state chamber or the African American chamber or your hyper local chamber, because at the end of the day, we all live and work in the great state of New Jersey and have things to contribute to our communities that are meaningful. And we don't need to be in competition for resources. We can actually expand the resource pool by working intentionally together. I am so incredibly thankful for each of you for contributing your time and your thoughts to this conversation. It has been too short, as I expected that it would be. This is a topic that is near and dear to my heart, and I'm so thankful that we had a chance to elevate your voices and the work that you do day in and day out. There will be more to come. For those of you who have joined us today, thank you for being a part of this conversation. Thank you if you work for a nonprofit or serve on a nonprofit board, or if you're in the corporate community and you're considering becoming more interested in the nonprofit sector, just thank you. I know that everyone's time is incredibly limited, and the fact that you spent some time with us today makes me feel hopeful for 2022, that given this variant stuff has felt a little daunting over the last 24 to 48 hours. And then to our nonprofit colleagues on the call, especially, just please take good care of yourselves. It was brought into the chat box very early about what the sector's burnout looks like right now. And I am incredibly grateful for all that you do and all that you will do. Take good care of yourselves and your staff. And if you're on a nonprofit board, think about the staff of the nonprofits and think about where you have opportunities to show appreciation. If you can give extra PTO days, if you have opportunities for holiday bonuses, anything you can do will go a long way in keeping our sector fully functioning and keeping the great talent that we've acquired in our sector. Thank you to all of you. I will send the recording out as soon as we have it available, and I hope that you'll join us on future conversations in 2022 about all of our diversity, equity, and inclusion conversations, and take good care of yourselves. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you.